Hey friends, in this video we're going to be talking about Canon full-frame mirrorless, hopefully 2018, hopefully EF mount, and why it's so important for them to do it. Mirrorless is not only a concept that seems to be pointing towards the future of imaging, mirrorless is also a workhorse option for people who want a smaller footprint. And so for me, granted, when I got into mirrorless, a big part there's a big conversation in my own head around that. It was like, okay, what do I value? Do I want to stick with Canon? Do I want to go with the 80D? That means I can still use my lenses, but my lenses aren't wide enough, blah blah blah. And so kind of to give you an idea, it was a big conversation around what's important to me, what about imaging do I want to maximize with a device that can at the very least shoot autofocus and video, because that was the big thing for me at the time. Now, what took me towards mirrorless and towards Sony in particular was innovation. That direction, that vision, which is kind of ensconced within mirrorless, is really what took me that direction. And I think that if Canon can start really making real mirrorless cameras, not just straight ports of the 80D, once Canon starts making real mirrorless cameras that really stand up, I think what that's going to do is that's going to tell everybody that pays attention, hey, look, we're serious, we have vision, we have a future in this industry, we want to go somewhere, and this is how we're getting there. And I think that that's what took me towards Sony, that's what could make me enthusiastic about Canon. And I'm really interested in what you think about that, because that's my own little personal story, but there's a lot more stories out there. So I've made a video about Canon in 4K in 2018 with a big shakeup that we should be seeing. So if you haven't seen that, go and check that out, because I'm gonna pull some stuff from that into here. Now the big thing is that Canon, let me backtrack. The big thing is that product development cycles for digital cameras take about 2 years. So when we saw the Sony A7, that took probably 2 or 3 years to make. The A7 II probably took 2 or 3 years to make. And the difference between those two is that they probably figured out most of what they needed to figure out in the first 1 or 2 years, and then started on the A7 II. And you can see that in that there aren't that many really big differences between the original A7 series and the A7 II series, and that's between A7, A7S, A7R, and the A7 II, A7S II, and A7R II. So what the big differences were, it feels like, was the body design and the IBIS. So while there was a huge resolution increase on the A7R to the A7R II, the inclusion of internal 4K recording from the A7S to A7S II, as well as much better autofocus performance across the range, with the exception of the A7S II, the big difference is the IBIS and the body design, right? So when we're thinking about a Canon mirrorless system, we're not only thinking about what it's going to be, but we're also thinking a little bit down the road what it could be too, and the way that they could segment that market, because that's Canon's specialty, is market segmentation, how they could segment that market in order to get to the next option. So we've seen Canon mirrorless being basically a straight port of a sensor from their DSLRs into a mirrorless body. So the sensor of the 80D is in the EOS M5, the EOS M6. What that means is that Canon is totally willing to put on sensor phase detect onto sensors they've previously kind of made, they've previously put together for another thing, in order to increase profit by maximizing production efficiency, right? So the actual differences between an 80D and an M5 are in the body, in the lens mount, and in the articulating screen. Like the sensor, the image quality is, for all intents and purposes, the same. There are some minor deviations at different ISOs for dynamic range. In terms of ISO performance, the M5 is a little bit better than the 80D. So there are minute differences. but the sensor is ultimately the same. The differences are probably due to some tweaking. So what I believe we should be looking for is, how are we going to see an existing full-frame sensor in a new mirrorless body? So what I believe we should be looking for is the sensor out of the 5D Mark IV. The sensor out of the 5D Mark IV, 36 megapixels, it's pretty good. It has acceptable dynamic range, it has acceptable ISO performance. It's not going to blow anything out of the water. It has perhaps better ISO performance than the D810, but it doesn't have as good of ISO performance as even like an A7R2 or an A7 II or an A7S II, obviously. Like the sensor for the 5D Mark IV is a very versatile all-around sensor that it seems to me, at any rate, as if it were developed to be a little bit general use. And that's what the 5D series is all about, right? So from that dual sensor, you can kind of mix and match the way you want to tweak that sensor in order to maximize particular other goals that you may have for that particular camera. Every camera is good at one or two things, but not necessarily good at everything. And that's because you get your sensor tweaked to be one particular thing. So what we're going to have to see from the 5D Mark IV sensor into, call it the EOS, whatever, the mirrorless version of it, is a tweaking either towards stills or video, towards dynamic range or ISO performance, and then we're going to have to see on sensor phase detection. Now, what we've seen out of Canon is that they can do all of that, right? So creating and crafting this mirrorless full-frame body shouldn't really be an issue for them. What's going to be the issue, though, is what lenses do you put on it? How do you mount lenses to it? What kind of lenses do you want to put on it? Now, in previous videos that I've made, I've said, well, why not just leave the camera, the DSLR as it is, but just take out, the SLR, right? Take out the mirror, take out the reflex, and so forth, and then just put the sensor in there and mount an EF lens to it. What it seems like could also be the case is something along the lines of what Sigma does with their Quattro series. So Sigma's Quattro SD and Quattro H are mirrorless bodies, and then they have an extended mount so that you can mount Sigma SA lenses to it, so that they didn't have to make a whole new version of their own lens mount. So they can, it's a very small market that they're trying to appeal to, as opposed to Canon's very large market, and so they didn't want to give any trouble to consumers over the lenses. Now, while Canon's market is much larger than Sigma's, I think we can learn something very critical from that, in that if anyone's bought into Sigma SA lenses, they really need to be able to have those be compatible to any Sigma camera that comes out. Where Canon is at, being as big as they are, with as many lenses as they have, is that a lot of people have bought into Canon lenses. And so the Canon lenses are what Canon kind of relies upon to keep people in Canon's ecosystem. Now, I've had other videos where I've talked about, do you need to stay locked into Canon bodies if you have Canon EF lenses? And through adapters, I think the answer is no. However, but a lot of people are going to keep and hold on to those lenses because they maintain their value. And so if Canon can make a mirrorless body that accepts EF lenses, or at the very least will give you a free adapter to accept those EF lenses, I think Canon's going to be, in a much better place, because they can appeal directly to everybody that already has EF full-frame lenses. So Canon's potential full-frame body is probably going to have to be on par with any A7 III series that's going to be coming out. Probably just the A7 III, not an A7R III or an A7S III. It's just going to be a dual general purpose photography machine. So from there, we got to figure out, it's going to have phase detection, it's going to have dual pixel autofocus, it's probably going to have 4K. We've kind of figured out that we can make the EF lenses work on that body, but we also got to figure out what's going to be special about this, right? So in my opinion, Canon's going to be putting 4K on APS-C prosumer DSLRs in 2018. I think they're going to do that through the 7D Mark III and the 90D. Those cameras, the 80D and the 7D Mark II, need to be updated, and they need to be updated soon, and I think that we should be seeing in early 2018 the iterations of those coming out. So when we're thinking about the full-frame mirrorless EF option, that's probably going to come later on, because that's going to be a higher dollar item, that's going to be a more niche item, so that consumers that are looking for a camera, or professionals that are looking for a smaller, lighter camera for FIFA, for the 2018 Olympics, they can all kind of get in when they need to in order to be able to do this. Now, I think full-frame 4K is going to happen. That's kind of where I was trying to go with that original bit, and I kind of sidetracked myself. I'm sorry about that. So 4K's got to happen. I think what Canon's going to be realizing very soon is that, you know, a plurality of phase-detect autofocus points is just as useful as a tighter spread, even if that, you know, can cover a good amount of, you know, the sensor. So like the spread, the 45-point AF spread on the 80D covers all the thirds, right? However, you can get nearly 90% of the frame covered with the phase detect autofocus points on the 6000, the 6300, the 6500, the 5100, you know, the XT2, the XT20. So I think that, you know, for Canon, the way that they need to be seeing mirrorless is through autofocus, through the lens of autofocus, if you will, is to cover as much of the sensor as possible. I think it can also make sense to implement DPAF. I think it can also make sense to have a potential for a tighter reticle option. So what that means is that the AF system is going to have to be very flexible. It's going to have to be world-class. It's going to have to be able to do everything for everybody, because Canon's going to be so late to the game. In terms of lenses, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for Canon to come out with a whole new lens lineup. It makes sense for Canon to work within their existing EF lenses as the primary source of lenses. So I don't think that we're going to see an EOS M5 style body. I think we're going to see, because that's kind of styled on the A7 series. I think we're going to see a more DSLR looking body out of Canon, because one of the things that Canon's, you know, universally recognized for is their ergonomics and the handling, and how you can pick up any camera, be it, you know, an SL2 or a Cine camera, and once you're used to Canon's controls, be able to use it with fluidity and ease. So I think that we're going to see a camera that maintains the ergonomic attention to detail that Canon has proliferated and been a huge proponent of in order to sell this mirrorless body better. I think they're going to have to choose that 36 megapixel sensor because it can be tweaked for more things more effectively. You can tweak it for higher ISO or for better dynamic range, but either way, you're going to still have a lot of resolution. So I think with thinking about potential for Canon full-frame mirrorless, what we're not going to be seeing out the gate is something, quote, entry-level like a 6D or a 6D Mark II. I think we're going to have to be seeing out of Canon full-frame mirrorless a very robust, versatile, do-everything option in order for Canon's mirrorless market to be and stay relevant. Now, Canon has a lot of impetus to do this now. Outside of just competition, which I believe should be more than enough impetus, what Canon is seeing is, you know, 70% growth or something based on the last financial record, or based on the last financials we have out of Canon, something like a 70% growth in their mirrorless segment. What that means is that Canon is recognizing internally to themselves that mirrorless is very important for them to be implementing. Now, and delivering to the competitive and complex marketscape of the ILC industry that we're seeing right now. In my opinion, it's gotta be competitive with as much as possible, and a more versatile, more professional option builds brand equity for Canon, and it tells consumers that Canon is very serious about this in order to kind of get the ball rolling a little bit quicker, so that when people are like, oh, well, I don't know if I want to stick with Canon, they're going to say, that is a North Star for where Canon's going. I think that this makes a lot of sense for them to be doing. I think it makes a lot of sense for them to be hyping up and be talking about a lot. So I expect that we'll see some pretty serious rumors and pretty serious confirmations around this early in 2018, if it's going to happen at all, at least in this next little time frame. So thank you very much for your time and for your attention. Thanks for walking down kind of rumor roundup and also kind of market perspective with me. So I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.